Good morning. Yeah. Good morning. My name is Nathalie Lecoq. I'm Director General of FEDIOL, and I'm pleased to welcome you to FEDIOL's annual event 23 here at the Sofitel and also online. We have a number of participants also online, so welcome to all of you. Just few housekeeping. The sessions are meant to be interactive, so in the room, obviously, if you have a question or a comment to make, please raise your hand. Online, please use the chat for your questions. Innovation driving sustainability and decarbonization in oilseeds processing is the title of this year's event, very topical. And to set the scene with some opening remarks, I invite Jordi Costa, who is president of FEDIOL and from Bangui, to come to the podium.
Well, just a correction, I'm president of FEDIOL, not president of Bangui. So just work in Bangui. Oh. Thank you. So welcome everyone to this event. So can you move to the first slide? So decarbonization, but not only decarbonization, because we have more challenges towards total sustainability. This is what we have. Can you move to first slide, please? Okay. Decarbonization is key for climate, and it's one of the key priorities in the EU. We have two challenges in front of us: Fit 55 in 2030 and 100% zero carbon by 2050. And our industry, thank you. And our industry is particularly impacted by these two challenges, by the decarbonization challenge, because our industry is energy intensive. Our industry has been heavily impacted in the last crisis, energy crisis of last year. We saw the price of electricity going from 20, 30 euros megawatt to 200, even 300 euros megawatt. The competitiveness of our industry was heavily impacted because we compete worldwide with other countries where the price of energy was 6 to 7 times lower. So our industry is at stake. So we have to do really the decarbonization the right way. According to the UN, food accounts for 30% of the world emissions. This is key. And the oilseed industry is part of that food system, and it's accountable for a big part of those emissions, mainly because of Scope 3. Agriculture is a big share of the emissions on the global emissions due to food. It's done in the agriculture. But we have a responsibility also in Scope 1 and Scope 2. So our own emissions is our first priority, but we have a key role to support farmers, to support the whole chain to lower the emissions in Scope 3. And this is going to be our major challenge. The first one has it's in our house. The second one is going to be a lot more complex, but we can play a key role into it. And the Green Deal, it has forced companies to make efforts, but also the companies have made their own commitments. A lot of our clients are making commitments, a lot of our suppliers or farmers are making commitments, or companies, the companies of our associations are making commitments. So we are all making commitments to decarbonize. And FEDIOL is supporting that effort. We started to report emissions from our industry on an aggregated basis. We will see it later. And FEDIOL is supporting the sharing of best practices of the industry. So if one knows how to do something better to use less carbon, we share it among the whole industry to try to improve our emissions as a whole. And there's one particular area where we have been very active over the last 10 years. It's also in biomass. Biomass usage is very natural to us. I mean, our products or raw material in the oilseed industry, one of them is, for instance, sunflower seed. It has already carbon that we use as biomass. It's a carbon the hulks are used, are burned, and the same plant that is providing protein and oil it's providing enough energy to process that protein and oil. Very sustainable, very circular. It's something that we need legislation to acknowledge that the same agricultural can be part of the solution. So I will not be long, so just some specific challenges we have is, as I said, we are energy intensive. We are using a lot of heat, a lot of power. We have to bring our goods that we process from 25 degrees to 200 degrees to make the process, to extract the oil, to extract the digestible protein. That is not simple. There are limitations on how much we can, there are physical limitations on how much we can decarbonize or how much energy we're going to use. Now, the source of that energy can be from different sources. That's going to be the challenge, okay? And we have to remember that we are an important part of the EU economy. We are the link between the farmer and the food manufacturer. We're the link for this food chain. And the vegetable oils and proteins are very essential. And more important, they have to be affordable. So it's not just a matter that to make them available, but they have to be at the right price. And that is making a big, big challenge, okay? So over the last 10 years, we've been, as I said, we've been making progress. We've been reducing our emissions. We're reducing the use of energy, but we have limitations. I mean, there's a point that we cannot be more efficient. And in order to go to the next level, we believe we need innovation. Innovation, a breakthrough of technology is what is going to help us to arrive there. And this is why we're here today. We're going to talk about innovation. We're going to talk about what possibilities we have in front of us to decarbonize, hopefully to zero, but for sure, much lower than where we are today. So with that, I thank everybody for being here, and let's start.
Thank you very much, Jordi, for these opening remarks. And without further ado, I will invite our keynote speaker to join us. Mr. Michael Pielke is in charge of economic sustainability in DG Agriculture. He is Acting Director Sustainability. Mr. Pielke, the floor is yours. We're really delighted to have you with us. Thank you.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you here in this FEDIOL conference. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to bring the perspective of the Common Agriculture Policy and DG Agriculture and Rural Development in this conference. Yeah, within the Green Deal, the EU committed with the European climate law that greenhouse gas emissions and removals are balanced within the European Union at the latest by 2050, with the aim to achieve negative emissions thereafter. And to ensure this above objective, the Commission released the Fit for 55 package, containing a set of proposals and modifications on key legislation that would allow the EU to reach more ambitious climate objectives. And the most relevant modification for agriculture is the land use change and forestry regulation. It defines for the first time a clear target for the EU sink in 2030, and each member state has to contribute according to their share on EU-managed land. Associated impact assessments and the modeling exercises run by the Commission tell us that the ambitious climate objectives such as the emission reduction by 55% in 2030 and the neutrality in 2050 are possible in a fair way. The pathway to neutrality shows that in some sectors, such as energy, we need to drastically reduce emissions. But it also tells us that all sectors should contribute, including the agriculture sector and the related supply chains. And here, there are several opportunities. First, reducing emissions of methane and nitrous oxides in the farm management, reduction of emissions related to the use of input, such as energy, fuel, and increase energy efficiency in all steps of the value chain. Furthermore, we have to embed more bioeconomy, such as the production of renewable energy and bio-based products, and circular economy in all phases of the supply chain. Specifically for the production phase, it is acknowledged that there are specific challenges for the reduction of emission. Most of the emission reduction actions represent additional costs. The EU farming system is very diversified, requiring the definition of tailored strategies. And last but not least, the quantification of the effect of the implementation of emission reduction practices is overall complex and costly. Emission reduction in agriculture cannot go to zero, and it will represent a big share of residual emissions which we will have in 2050. But still there's potential of agriculture to contribute to the reduction of emissions, and we will do that. What are the practices which are needed? So we have to increase good practices as technologies such as precision agriculture, variable rate of distribution of nutrients, anaerobic digestion, feed strategies, and additives in the livestock sector. A methane strategy has also been adopted by the Commission with specific actions for the sector. It emphasizes the need to have updated lists of good practices and technologies and to help farmers to assess their own greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies with farm calculators. It also wants to mainstream methane emission reduction in the EU sectorial policies, research program support, and in international policies. We have farm decision supporting tools such as a farm sustainability tool for nutrients of the CAP that are very important to help farmers and in member states to reduce emissions from their nutrient inputs. But there's an important particularity in the land sector, which is the possibility to contribute to the reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through plants and their photosynthesis. And we have targeted initiatives launched for the EU SINC. In December 2021, the Commission published a communication entitled Sustainable Carbon Cycle and adopted in November 2022 a proposal for a framework regulation on the certification of carbon removals, which is the first EU-wide voluntary framework to reliably certify high-quality carbon removals. This Commission proposal on the certification of carbon removals is very important for the farming and the forestry sector. It is the first step to enable a vision of carbon farming becoming a new source of income, as well as a strong force for climate change mitigation. For this, the land sector has a unique role. The communication mentions several practices which are beneficial for carbon protection and increase. We can name agroforestry, cover crops, conservation tillage, afforestation and reforestation, restoration of wetlands, palydiculture, and among them. The wide uptake of good land management practices in agriculture and forestry lands can help the EU to revert the decline of its SINC, to reach the targets of the new LULUCF regulation and the level of SINC necessary to balance residual emissions in 2050. Removals in the land sector through carbon farming have specific challenges, such as monitoring, reporting, and verification on the permanence, and it deserves special attention for its strict interconnection with adaptation, soil fertility, food production, and other environmental aspects, such as biodiversity. So we have to see, we need in the certification system a reliable system. That's what we certify in terms of carbon reduction is permanent and is also not harming other important objectives which we have. Another important role of agriculture and forestry is the provision of feedstock for the development of bio-based economy and replace the use of fossil fuel. Here, farmers and foresters should have an active role in the value chain and not simply the suppliers of biomass. The challenge is that land is a finite resource. So there is the need to program land use in a way that is able to provide food, biomass for the bioeconomy, and ecosystem services such as biodiversity, water purification, etc. And all under the increasing pressure from climate change and extreme events. Mainstreaming of funds for the decarbonization of the sector, carbon sequestration and adaptation can be done through several EU policies. We have the Common Agricultural Policy, we have LIFE programs, we have the Regional Development Fund, Horizon Europe, and its mission, A Soil Deal for Europe. The Common Agricultural Policy remains the main tool to help to establish a climate-friendly value chain in practice. We are focused on the production phase, even if there are also elements for the whole supply chain. The Common Agricultural Policy, and that's our challenge, has several objectives to address: economic, environment, and social sustainability, all of which are important and very much interconnected. Climate mitigation, adaptation, renewable energy and efficiency, bioeconomy are clearly mentioned in the CAP-specific objectives. And within our CAP strategic plans, we address those objectives. Among those I can mention we have obligatory requirements for all farmers receiving CAP support, conditionality, for example, when it comes to requirements for peatlands, crop rotation, or soil cover. Above that, we have voluntary commitments in this area, which we fund through eco-schemes or agri-environment climate commitments, which reward farmers and foresters who are willing to contribute more to carbon storage in soils, such as the maintenance of agroforestry system, conservation of peatlands and wetlands. To deliver on carbon removals and emission reduction, farmers need to switch to new production modes, and this all comes with a cost. Upfront investments, indeed, are an important barrier to the uptake of relevant practices. And the CAP is particularly suited to compensate farmers for these initial costs, for example, via the mentioned eco-schemes, rural development measures, and investment support. In addition, we support the process providing funding for advisory systems, piloting solutions, and new rewarding schemes. It is also important to note that a minimum of 25% of our direct payments to farmers should be dedicated to eco-schemes, and at least 35% of the EAFRD should be dedicated to environmental and climate objectives. Last year, the Commission has approved 28 CAP strategic plans for the implementation of the Common Agricultural Policy from 2023 to 2027. A first overview of the approved CAP strategic plans shows that more than 35% of the utilized agricultural area is planned to receive support beyond the baseline to reduce emissions or to store carbon in soils and biomass, 35%. Eco-schemes and rural development measures are broadly used by many member states to support beneficial practices, such as agroforestry, vegetation cover in orchards and arable crops, the reinforcement of crop rotation, conservation agriculture, the inclusion of trees and non-productive vegetation, land conversion, and several forestry interventions, such as afforestation and forest management. Further actions in the CAP strategic plans to reduce methane and ammonia emissions focus on ruminants by optimized feeding and supporting investments in biogas production, manure management, and genetic improvement. Targeted supports were provided for investments, productive, which also bring economic gain, and non-productive investments. From the CAP's strategic plans we have approved last year, we can see that all member states included target area-based interventions for carbon storage, and most member states have chosen CAP support for the deployment of the bioeconomy and renewable energy and efficiency in rural areas. To close, agriculture has an important role in the EU decarbonization, and it can also be part of the solution. For example, with carbon sequestration and the development of a bio-based economy. There are several challenges in this process which ask for tailored strategies and financial support. Food production, environmental and social sustainability are interconnected objectives of the Common Agricultural Policy, and we have to find significant synergies between agriculture, production and the climate objectives. Finally, we have to find a synergy between public and private funding, for example, by the establishment of innovative rewarding mechanisms within the supply chain, because those are necessary to make the land sector effective contributing to the ambitious EU climate targets. And I believe that we, under the CAP, we can make this offer to member states and to the sector and to the whole food supply chain, but many of our measures are voluntary, and there is also up to the sector and to the industry to take up and to use these measures which we offer to improve the situation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pielke, for setting the context and also highlighting the measures that are already foreseen. I think that's very helpful as we will look in the second panel. You accepted eventually one question or two, if there is, and I'm looking at the room, if there is anybody who would have a point to raise or a question to put forward. Please, can you briefly introduce yourself?
I'm a little bit surprised that
We need a microphone. Sorry.
I'm a little bit surprised that the objective for agri-sector for 2050 is not to be zero, with the emissions. If I listen correctly, you said that agri-sector will not be able to zero emissions, isn't it? And in our view as processors, it is the only chance, to be negative in the whole chain, if really farming is contributing to the zero.
On this, we have to say that, of course, agricultural activity will always create emissions. But at the same time, we have to, with our agricultural activities, by, for example, activities land management, which provides for carbon storage in land, we have to counterbalance this.
Yes, please. Beatrix.
Thank you. Beatrix Richards. I was just, I had a question about the definition of EU managed land. So what does that actually cover? So that was my question. Thanks.
Yeah, managed land is a very broad concept. It comprises agricultural land. It also includes forestry land. It includes also land managed in urban areas. But it's not a concept which is defined in the agricultural policy. We define in our policy what we consider as agricultural land, also in the context of our policy.
And it's also within the EU as well, is that right? So it's within the EU boundaries.
Yeah, we talk about the EU. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Pielke, I see there is another. Can I go forward? I don't want to stretch it.
No, no problem.
Adam, please. Sorry.
Thank you. Very short question. Adam Stempin, Polish Association of Oil Producers. You mentioned about the carbon sequestration in agriculture. In my opinion, there's a problem. We cannot take it into account when the methodology of the GHG emission of the feedstock is concerned. That's the best example is methodology in RED2. Of course, we know that plants are taking lots of CO2, but still it's not taken into account. So we cannot use it to show our footprint. So what is the solution to take it into account in the future?
I'm afraid that's a very technical question, and I would understand if Mr. Pielke would say that this is a bit difficult for him to respond. I think maybe we can follow up on this with services later on, but it's for sure a very important point, which I know our sector, but also upstream, is very concerned about. So last, Jordi.
Yes, President of FEDIOL. Just like you mentioned that agriculture is a problem, but it can be part of the solution to decarbonize. I think you also mentioned that it comes at a cost, which make our farmers less competitive and make probably the food in Europe more expensive. Now, I think there's a challenge how the farmer is going to deal with the imports of food from other countries. And then the question is, how are we going to deal with imports? Or are we outsourcing the emissions to another country? Are we just making the problem somewhere else and just becoming very green here and making more emissions elsewhere? How do we manage that?
Yeah, this is of course a very important question, the question of the kind of a level playing field, and that's also, I think, important that we get on broader international level also the acknowledgement and the change. What we can do under the CLP is, of course, that we promote the change in Europe in the agricultural sector, and I've mentioned a lot of measures which we have to help farmers to develop a new business model. Among them, support to change farming practices, to promote investments. But I think also with the certification which is proposed for the carbon thing, that's also, I think, something which can be a potential tool to support the farming sector if we acknowledge the storage done by farmers and also certifies, because it can also be a kind of tool to reward them in this process.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Pielke. I would like to give you a round of applause. Thank you for your participation here. Herzlichen Dank. So, after these introductory speeches, we will now turn to the first panel with two speakers who will intervene and focus on industry. We will look into the industry's potential for decarbonization. And we have first Thomas Wijns, who is researcher at the Brussels VUB. And Thomas has an extensive knowledge in European and international climate policy. He will address decarbonization pathways for ETS and non-ETS industries through the EU. Thomas, I'm delighted to welcome you here, please.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to try to tell a lot of things today. Focused on the transition, the European transition, global transition, also the context in which your sector will have to operate. We operate in a quite disruptive environment at the moment. And one of the challenges, of course, is the deep mitigation, Fit for 55, 2050 climate neutrality that is ahead of us. I'll talk a bit about experiences we had with other industries, steel, chemicals, cement, what they're doing, what they are doing, the roadmaps, the actions, the goals they have set. And then we move into what new type of policies are emerging, and with a big focus on the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is, through its scope and approach, groundbreaking. And we see a lot of European member states still absorbing, and the European Commission also absorbing the impact of that. Then we zoom in more into your sector and industries. We did a small SWOT, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We look broadly at the greenhouse gas mitigation options, what are the challenges ahead to implement everything, and then what could the public sector, Commission, do to help you implement these strategies. And then we have a small ending slide on how do you start, and some of you have already started with this transition. So when I gave a similar presentation, I think around 2 years ago, I think it was during COVID, I mentioned there were 3 major challenges, disruptive potential challenges in the food production value chain. And we have had to edit one since then. There's land use, climate change, mitigation targets, and of course the new geopolitical element. And when it comes to land use, indeed, it's the raw materials, it's our planet, it's the earth we use. We are dealing with a growing population, maybe a changing diet in the future. We are facing a biodiversity collapse, and part of the collapse includes pollinating insects, and that is, let's say, the start of part of your value chain, something that can be quite disruptive. Impacts of climate change, also potential disruptor of value chains with crop harvest failures due to combination of drought and flooding. That is climate change. So it can include issues with regard to food security, and of course this can have an amplifying effect which leads to social unrest. Part of the unrest we have seen a decade ago in the Middle East was triggered by food security issues. And then finally, geopolitical risks, something we as researchers, and we didn't account for a while, but we now see that war and food can be used as a weapon, and I'm pretty sure this has affected your sector too. Climate change is an important one because it's so-called threat multiplier. If more land becomes less arable, there is pressure on land use, on crop yields, and again, this can increase geopolitical risks with regard to drought, access to water, access to agriculture products. So this is the context, and it's not an easy context to operate in. And if we look at the predictions with regard to climate change, also the geopolitical context currently, it's not going to become easier. And the final one, the mitigation. Europe has set a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and it was the first industrial region to commit itself to this goal. And of course, consequently, targets have been updated, including targets for 2030, with an increased ambition to be less energy dependent on regions around the world. So with targets of 55%, ETS sector is going to be facing very ambitious reductions, more than 60% by 2030. And actually, if we look at the number of allowances that will be available by the 2040, the emission room will be very small for ETS sectors. Non-ETS sectors will see an increase in ambition. Of course, renewable energy is getting a boost with the targets that have finally been upgraded to something quite ambitious. And of course, energy savings stays an important element here. And one of the questions referred to this, it's the whole economy that will have to go to net zero, and of course we have negative emissions thereafter, maybe even before. So a whole part of your supply, value chain, customers will be in the same boat, and that is something you will have to take into account when forming strategies, and I'll come back to that could do that later. It goes for everybody, and it's not the quote was, "It's the economy stupid." No, it's the whole economy stupid now. So I don't know much about your sector, I have to be honest. I am comfortable. I worked a lot with steel sector, with chemical sector, cement sector, glass, and ceramics, and refining. And a couple of years ago, they asked us, when the Commission was preparing its 2050 target, to develop an overarching roadmap for these industries, the most energy-intensive industries in Europe. And that was possible because all of these industries had developed their own strategies and roadmap. And we looked at many things too. Of course, we looked at what is the potential, what are the technologies there, what are the challenges. And if we look at it from the technology side, then we see that for most of these industries, there are options to go for deep decarbonization. There's still quite a few bit of research to do, but they've thought about it and they've started to implement it. And for steel, their options can be carbon capture, utilization, storage. A prominent route we now see is hydrogen in steel production. For chemicals, it's a broad list of options: electrification, biomass use, CCU again, of course. Circular economy and plastics is very important. Same goes also for fertilizers, green hydrogen production. So the pathways we see in general are electrification, hydrogen, CCU, CCUS, biomass. That is the main routes we see. And I'll come back to the options I see for your sector. They're not the same, but they're going to be quite similar. And of course, for all of these industries, if they have not done it before, because they're energy intensive, energy efficiency is always going to be a key element. But it's not only roadmaps, and this is truly fascinating. We now see investments in demo or beyond in these key industries. And for instance, the green steel or hybrid is building a demo plant for hydrogen-based steel making, and there are many more announcements and projects going in that direction, also by other companies. On the bottom left, we see Port of Antwerp, and thanks to the EU ETS Innovation Fund, one of the first large industrial scale CCS projects will be constructed or is being constructed there, and it covers the full value chain from capture, transport to storage. And on the bottom right is maybe a science fiction picture, but it's real. It is the concept of an electrical naphtha cracker, and it could, over time, still some R&D to be done, 2030, 2035, replace the classical naphtha steam crackers in the chemical industry. It's an electrification of a complex, high-temperature process, and it's really a bit the holy grail of industrial transition, reaching high temperatures with electrification, and even that is being tackled at the moment. But there are also challenges, and they will also be similar for your sector. 2050, it looks, it's less than 30 years from today, but overall, it's for these big companies, it's one major investment cycle away from today. So that next investment must already be quite compatible with 2050. You'll need access to new energy streams, feedstocks, and in particular, green energy will be an issue. And it, of course, must be affordable, it must be reliable, and it must be, of course, zero CO2. There will be a need for infrastructure, major infrastructure works across Europe, connecting industrial hubs, hydrogen, CO2, reinforcement of electricity grids. There is further R&D support needed for demonstration and for first-of-a-kind plans. These companies, these investments, certainly for the newer types of technology, they will face a higher capital investment cost. And if you electrify, the odds are that your operational cost will be higher, especially compared to using gas before. there might be regulatory misalignment where the public sector, the commission, the government tells you to do one thing that leads to higher energy use, but at the other hand, you need to reduce emissions and energy use. An issue could be there for many sectors. And of course, this is a radical transition over a short time period, and in the meantime, you want to stay in business. So you have to maintain your international competitiveness during this transition. So while there's a lot of things going on, there are investments happening, the environment in which this will need to happen is still quite challenging. We're by far not there yet. So if you look at the policy responses around the world, and I've mentioned the EU's response before, which is a more classical regulatory response. We set a target, we set a price on carbon, we set rules. There's a new player on the block, and it's something that was quite unexpected. It's what happened in the United States, and it's the Inflation Reduction Act. It's very, very recent. It's from the science we get, it can be truly transformational, and it has a different approach from what we have been doing here so far. In total, 317 billion US dollar support, mostly via tax credits, tax breaks, loans, and subsidies. And of course, it has a multiple purpose. It wants to green the US economy, but it also increase energy security. It wants to promote domestic manufacturing, a new Green Deal, and it wants to use the public sector power to get there by financing, but also via public procurement. And it finances a lot. It will use tax credits, major tax breaks, and even your tax breaks can be so big that you get money back. There is a return clause. So if you earn less than what your tax break would be on the sold hydrogen or so, you will get subsidies instead. So it goes quite far. It's huge volumes of money, also quite generous. And it goes for battery production, clean energy production, hydrogen production. And not only to ensure that this production happens in the US, but also that the consumers of green electricity and green hydrogen get access to cheap green electricity and cheap hydrogen. And there are major production tax credits there. And these numbers here are like $3 per kilogram for hydrogen production with renewable energy. They're not set coincidentally. They're set in such a way that if an ammonia fertilizer producer or a steel producer that starts using this subsidized hydrogen will be competitive with, let's say, an ammonia producer that uses natural gas or a steel producer that is based on coal. They are aimed to make these basic manufacturers stay competitive and be green. So it's an extremely powerful, a lot of money involved. Also support for carbon capture and utilization, support for new process technologies in industries with demonstration. That's something the US didn't have. They had some very good basic research, pilot research, but demonstrations like the EU ETS Innovation Fund support, they didn't have that. Well, they have it now. There's going to be an increase in loans for energy efficiency, loans for clean production. And interestingly, because you will also be confronted with that, there will be research and the development of green labels, so that you know that the cement or the steel I purchase will be green. And this is going to be important because the US wants to create a lead market for these products using green public procurement, that the buildings and the roads and the bridges that are going to be constructed in the US will be made with clean steel using the labels. They have clean steel and clean concrete and so on. It's extremely powerful. Another example, I'll have a few examples, is the SDE++ in the Netherlands. It's an operational subsidy where you get subsidies for the use of new installations for a period of 12 to 15 years. The subsidy varies. It's not fixed, and it depends on the CO2 and energy prices. And The range of subsidies is broad, but not very broad. It goes for renewable electricity, gas, heat, and CO2 poor heat and production, or low CO2 heat and production as from 2020. So as from 2020, it started including, well, there was a US tune, so I appreciate it, that also industrial production using a low CO2 heat will be included. For industry specifically, also biomass use and electrification of heat, CCUS, are included. And it was hard to translate, but it's what will be subsidized is an unprofitable top. It's where your investment, your cost, your total costs are not profitable, but you take into account what the energy prices and the CO2 costs are. So if you would save less money in purchasing CO2 allowances by having your investment than it actually costs, you get subsidized. But if basically if the CO2 price would be high and the power price would be high, you might still make a profit and then you don't get a subsidy. So it varies every year. It's quite an important budget that is available. It's around 8 billion available for 2023, so it's 3 billion euros higher compared to the previous rounds, could lead to 4 million ton CO2 reduction in the Netherlands. They were a bit worried because it's quite a competitive mechanism where they work in rounds, and in the first round, the technologies and the companies with the cheapest cost per ton of CO2 get the reward, and then it goes up and up and up. That if you end up with the more expensive technologies, heat pump technologies, CCUS, and so that the pots might be empty. And so that's why the Dutch government decided to earmark part of the budget for specific categories so that the cheapest or the most cheapest measures don't eat up the whole pot. So that's a new innovation there in the Netherlands. In the EU, similar measures, we have our EU ETS Innovation Fund, which is important. It will increase in budget over 40 billion euros until 2030. It, of course, depends a bit on the carbon price. It's aimed at innovative breakthrough technologies in industry, innovative renewables, CCS, and hydrogen technologies. It covers around 60% of the relevant extra cost, which includes the capital, but also operational expenditure. But it is closely linked to the extra costs that come with the introduction of the new technology or the innovation. And interesting also is that there is a form of ex-ante partial reward payment. So you don't have to invest in everything and then fingers crossed the technology works and then you can get subsidies. Also, if you achieve certain technological or other milestones, part of the budget will be released. It's a highly competitive system, so there is a success rate of 1 out of 30 projects that are submitted. There are synergies with InvestEU, with the EIB, and there is an idea of introducing a competitive tendering mechanism, contracts for difference in the future. Another instrument, it's state aid related, is the industrial project of common European interest on hydrogen. Has been approved 5.4 billion euros, so it's national state aid that gets approved by the EU. And then there is, and that was the, let's say, the limited response of the EU to the US Inflation Reduction Act, the Net Zero Industry Act. It's relevant for industry because it will enable support for heat pumps, biogas, CCS, but also includes simplifying of permitting in the future, the creation of regulatory sandboxes where you can work very innovatively without too much regulatory oversight. There is a target for CO2 storage, green procurement is included, skills, job creation, education, but very little is being said about, what will be the volume of the support? Who will pay for all this? And mostly is that, there will be coordination of support by the member states. So it's still only a first step. Some highlights: France, Germany, and the UK. France has thanks to COVID, a recovery program first, a bit of a cohesive industrial strategy in France. France has a history also with with biomass use support. Germany has an industrial transition plan focused on new technologies, CCS hydrogen, but also an idea to work on contracts for difference for hydrogen. And very recently, and this is quite exciting and controversial, also support for high electricity prices in industry. Something where the last word has not been said on, might be copied at the EU level, but it's something to watch for. UK has been quite doing interesting and innovative work in industrial transition with setting a goal of a first net zero industrial cluster by 2040. So looking at the industrial transition from a cluster perspective is something we should do more here too. And so now we come back to your sector, transition options and challenges. We started off with doing a little SWOT for your industry. And what do we think? And we might be wrong. We don't know the industry that well. So correct me later, please. What do we see as strengths? Of course, strengths in Europe for your industry are the experience with the production process and the know-how that has been developed here over time, the diversification in diverse raw materials. It's not one stream you depend on, it's multiple streams, comes from multiple countries, so that creates a bit of security. We have a well-developed logistics and value chain in Europe, and of course, it's a major asset. We often forget it, but it's our EU internal market. And if we should ask the Brits now, because this is a very powerful instrument which we often ignore too much. Weaknesses, of course, energy prices and costs. That's high in Europe, certainly high in specific regions. An issue for your sector in general is our low margins, which means that, if you have low margin, you also low margin to move with regard to, investments and operational cost of the production. So this is a major issue. We see it in some energy-intensive sectors come back too, but I've seen the figures for your industry overall. It's not big, and it's something where you will need some policy support, certainly if we go into disruptive new breakthrough technologies or alternative fuels and electricity with higher operational expenditures. We see innovation, but limited. There is innovation, and we also see limited dedicated innovation support for your industry. Threats, I've mentioned a few before: climate disruption, geopolitical disruption. There might be radical, fast regulatory changes that happen. Also can be part of the Scope 2 emissions. Think about issues with regard to deforestation, land use change, and forestry. Also, as I mentioned before, your whole value chain and supply chain and customers will have to go climate neutral, so that your customer might say, I'm a big, I don't know what, yogurt or whatever producer, I want to go climate neutral, so you're in my Scope 2, you need to be climate neutral too. So it might be an issue that you will be facing more in the future. And of course, I give the example, there might be other regions around the world, and I look in particular at the US, that might be more generous with industrial strategies and policy. So while in the past we thought about an unlevel playing field as countries that were more ambitious on climate change, set stricter rules, we might be facing an unlevel playing field against countries that are more generous in financing and helping industry do the transition. Opportunities. Of course, piggyback on other industries by using innovations that are happening there, particularly with regard to electrification, biomass use. There is definitely an option for deeper sector-focused innovation here. It will require support from Europe, from member states. The raw materials range can be broadened. Some innovative things such as algae, seaweed might become an option in the future. Newer markets might open up. Your sector is very familiar with biomass use energetically, biofuels. but there might be a market opening up in the chemicals industry for production of high-value chemicals based on celluloses derived from husks and so on. So there are options there that might be there in the future, or protein where we have value chain protein for feed to human consumption, meat replacements which are heavily protein, might become a bigger market, but the last word hasn't been said on that yet. And of course, an opportunity to find synergies with other industries. If you are located in industrial clusters, it could be really interesting to look at energy synergies, in particular waste heat use, but it's not something that's going to be an option for everyone. So the greenhouse gas mitigation options. Again, I listed the same ones that I listed before with the energy-intensive industries: energy efficiency, enhanced use of biomass, electrification, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Out of these 5, for your industry, we think the 3 first will be the most relevant. Hydrogen might be an option, but consider, hydrogen is made by electricity. Electricity costs 3 times more than natural gas at the moment. If you're gonna use hydrogen for heating to burn stuff, you can do the calculation how expensive it could be. So it looks off the table. Maybe in regions with extremely cheap solar, Southern Europe could be, but for now, not. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, maybe, but then you will need to be in the position of benefiting of another industry, chemical, steel, cement, that has done the major investment in infrastructure and where you can just tap into, because your emissions will be very, 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 very small compared to a steel plant or a cement plant. So what's left? Energy efficiency. We think there is an important potential there, but not business as usual. It will require new breakthrough technologies. And the goal here would be to ensure that you can lower the temperature that you'll need for your process, maybe 10, 20, 30% via breakthrough technologies, because that will facilitate the next thing, which is electrification. If you can lower the temperature, low heat electrification will become a major option, a heat pump. And of course, you must control the OPEX, the electricity price there. And of course, the sector has major experience with biomass use, and that is something that can be further enhanced in the future. So strategic mitigation approach with a focus on electrification. How would that look? So there is a high heat demand in the industry, but if we compare it to steel or chemicals, a relative low temperature, and the higher temperatures are defined here in the refining, in crushing, it might be even lower. So it's important to find innovation to lower temperature, heat demand in these processes. There is ongoing R&D in advanced heating technologies. Think of microwave use, radio frequency, but also in particular for use sector, there has been some research on advanced ultrasonic, where you create these bubbles and cavities, and that can lead to help in bleaching and degumming and lowering the temperatures. If you electrify, you will always aim for higher efficiency, higher overall efficiency. Ideally, you go for a factor 2 improvement in the overall efficiency, starting from the fuel to the end use, because electricity will have to compete with natural gas. And if natural gas is 2-3 times cheaper, your electricity system must be much more efficient. So that is a major challenge there. Industrial heat pumps, large heat pumps are coming. So we're seeing heat pumps over 30 megawatts entering the market, but it is a huge investment, and of course the operational expenditure again depends on the power price. Industrial energy symbiosis can be major options, using waste heat upgraded via heat pumps from other industries that are located nearby. And of course, with electrification, your scope 2 becomes more important. I need green electricity. So this also means that you will need secure the green PPAs, but also ensure that the network you have access to is powerful enough to provide the electricity. And a final one, of course, and that's not an easy one, our future electricity system will be mainly driven by variable renewable energy sources. So it would be interesting if you can find a business model which includes demand response, where you can vary the heat or electricity for heat demand according to the price and the availability of renewable energy. It's not an easy one. There are many sectors that are struggling with. Only part of the non-ferrous metal industry has partially solved this issue, but it basically requires a higher capital investments because you will need, for instance, more storage. You will need to increase your production capacity so you can produce more if the power price is low, and then store that and produce less if the power price is high. So it's not an easy one to deal with. So what do we see as the barriers and challenges for the transition of your industry? We see still some major R&D opportunities and challenges, advanced electrification technologies, efficiency technologies. We see important investment challenge, and that relates back to the small margins I referred to before. We're talking about breakthrough technologies. This means major refurbishments or even replacements of major production assets. This is a high capital intense investment, comes also with a high risk, and it's not a greenfield, it's often a brownfield development. And even for smaller and medium enterprises, this issue might even become worse. The OPEX, I've mentioned it before, high electricity prices can be an issue preventing electrification, not only for your industry, but for basically the whole economy. There will be major infrastructure needs if you talk about industrial symbiosis, heat networks, but also electrification will require larger cables and higher capacity electricity access, which might not be there at the moment, and it might take time to get it, because it's not only your sector, but it's also the rest of the economy that is trying to electrify a lot of things. I think of buildings, think of transport, and think of other industrial sectors. You will need a risk-sharing framework for industrial symbiosis. If you depend on waste heat from another industry, or you deliver waste heat to another industry, you must make sure that if another company goes bankrupt, that you're not stuck with something you can't use anymore. There might be location disadvantages for companies that are not having the opportunity for symbiosis or have limited access to green electricity, pointing then more to the use of biomass. So while we see options, we also see major challenges out there. But it's good that we know them now, because it's also going to be policy and industrial strategies that will need to address them. I believe an industrial strategy, and it's a concept for your sector, could entail a dedicated R&D program with focuses on advanced technologies for highly efficient crushing and refining technologies within the framework of electrification. Make sure that there are also new electrification technologies considered that could be used. Not giving a guarantee that anything will come from this, but it's definitely something to look into, because if we don't, we'll never know. This further R&D for new electrification technology I mentioned before. Facilitate the access to low temperature heat from other industries. So make sure that this strategy assesses your needs. Where can it be used? Where can it come from? And how much will it cost? And who will finance these investments? There will need to be capital support for these new breakthrough technology investments. Certainly for large industrial heat pumps that are quite expensive, there will need to be subsidies. There's no doubt about that. And you will need to find, and that's I don't know what will happen here, but there will need to be operational expenditure support for the energy costs, in particular for electrification. And that's where these ideas that are emerging in Germany, but also in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US can become important. So this area is really something to look at in the future. It will be a make or break for the transition, not only of your sector, but of many other sectors and actually the economy as a whole. So finally, my last slide. How can companies start the transition? And I know that many of you are already started, have set targets, for instance, or are looking at net zero goals. But it is important to not only set a goal, but also to develop a vision, but also link it with a strategy and include scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Not that you have to deal with all of them, but that you're just aware of them and what could happen with these. You will need to do a risk assessment of your whole supply chain and value chain, because they will also be facing these challenges, or your supply chain might be facing climate issues in the future. Important to start the implementation of the strategy as soon as possible. And that in particular means the development of an investment plan and financing plan. And I'm not saying this thing, start with a strategy, start with a plan, and do it because of the climate or because of you, but it's because if you do this, you can start to communicate better with policymakers. You can tell them what you want to do and what you need. Politicians and policymakers, the thing they prefer is cutting ribbons. That's something they really like. So if you can, I'm simplifying the story a bit, but if your investment plan includes this new state-of-the-art heat pump, and you can tell a politician, this is what we want to invest in, this is what we need to do it, they might be happy to support you, because they might also be able to cut a ribbon later on. But it's mostly about communicating, not only to the government, but also to stakeholders, so just to know what you need. And it's only by figuring out what you need yourself that you can get help from the other side. You'll have to communicate also to employees. You will need to dare to question your existing business models, because they might become under threat in the future. And of course, good practice is review of the strategy every 5-6 years, adapt where needed. And of course, where needed, start training employees for new skills. Just a basic concept idea on how to start. And that's more or less all I had to say so far. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Wow, there is a lot to think about, and we will certainly look into it in more detail during the discussion. I'm now turning to our next speaker, Stefan Gekire, Chair of the FEDIOL Industry and Environment Subworking Group, and he's also in real life Environmental Regulatory Compliance Lead of Cargill. Stefan, I'm happy to welcome you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you, good morning. So I have the honor to show you for the first time as FEDIOL that the CO2 monitoring figures for our sector that we emit at our sites. So it's a challenge. It was a challenge. It took a lot of time and discussion. And for the first time we are there to show some figures also. So I think it's already a good start for our sector and for our companies. So why did we do that? We want to reach the goal of net zero, of course, like all of the industry, and we have also been signing the Code of Conduct on Responsible Food Business for our sector. So that was an important decision made, and that implies also that we as a sector, we have to be clear also on what our CO2 emissions are and how this evolves in the future. We had a lot of discussions within our group, the Industry and Environment Working Group. I want to thank all the members that contributed to that. It looks simple at the beginning, but as several companies and in the membership of FEDIOL, it's not always obvious to align on that. But we came there, and we wanted also to be a bit proactive on the results, that we finally, if we see the results, that we do not have to correct figures because we did bad scoping or wrong scoping. So we asked member companies to report the figures for the last 4 calendar years. And we started therefore in 2019, so we went back to 2019 and we reported until 2022. So it will be no surprise for all of you that this period was a challenging period. So, and that's why we went back to 2019, where we said that might be have been a normal year. We had COVID in between, and we had a serious energy crisis, so affecting obviously all these activities. We looked as well as ETS to ETS and non-ETS plants. So most of our companies are ETS, are falling under ETS, but we have also companies not falling under ETS. So we had to have both these companies into the numbers. ETS, the advantage of ETS, there you have validated data on scope 1. Non-ETS, we needed to have some more calculations done by the members. And talking about calculations, I want to acknowledge also the work of Julius Hausberger in our team from Sime Darby. He did a very good job in coordinating. He's very smart in spreadsheets. And so that helped a lot. So that was very helpful. We looked at scope 1 and scope 2. So scope 1 is the emissions that really are produced at our sites within our fence. Scope 2 is our emissions that are produced outside of our site, but because of our activities. That's the power generated elsewhere and that we consume in our production. So that's, we looked at both. If you look at ETS, then we speak about scope 1 only. So we had to include also scope 2. And I think after what Thomas has been telling, electrification is a key thing. So if we want to monitor in the future our emissions, we have to look at both scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But that obviously that made it a little bit more complicated. We only wanted to look at the CO2 emitted to produce our products that are covered by the members or are produced by the members of FEDIOL. That's oil and meal. So we excluded activities on site like biodiesel or bottling. So we wanted to have excluded them, or sometimes other activities that are at the same site. So really look at the core production. Again, an extra complexity, but it we can find then figures that are very relevant for our sector. Also, what we corrected is in case that one of our sites produces energy for third parties that is sold, like power. In most cases, it's power. It can be steam that is sold, and in some countries over the last years, it was quite interesting to produce a lot of power. We have sites with huge combined heat power machines, but yeah, that's not producing oil and meal, so that has other drivers. Strictly spoken, you have to include them. They are part of your scope 1 emission, but again, to avoid any bias on the final figures, we wanted to exclude them. And that's what we did. Certainly, looking back at the past year, with an energy crisis, we could expect quite some fluctuations there in third-party energy generation. So there was quite good participation by the members. You see there the companies in alphabetical order that contributed, so thanks again for those companies. There's still room for other companies to join, of course. Then we can amend and add it to the figures, going back to 2019 likely. And how did we work on that? So I mentioned already the report. We had a good spreadsheet for that. Sites had to send it to FEDIOL Secretariat. Obviously, we wanted to guarantee as much as possible all confidentiality. Energy is an important cost factor for our production. And they were processed by the FEDIOL Secretariat and by Koen over the last weeks. It was quite a challenging job to get and to filter out. There were some errors also sometimes in the reporting, so that's how it goes. But thanks again for all, for the FEDIOL Secretariat and for the companies that have been reporting. If you look at the results, we have these forms filled in. We have been asking for data. We split up the sector in crush and refining and then in standalone refining, further processing, so hardening, fractionation, and so these are, I think, the two main groups that we have in FEDIOL. So we split it up that way. And we had reports, and you see there between 25 and 30, obviously there is an exact number, but that all due to the fact that we want to keep it a bit confidential so that you cannot, we avoid any way of being able to calculate back. So, and for standalone refineries, it was something between 5 and 10 companies that reported. So the calculation was done with that spreadsheet. So we had two results, obviously, one for crush and refining and one for the standalone refineries. We finally had two figures for these groups. We had a CO2 figure, CO2 equivalent figure from all the sites, and we had also the sum of raw materials processed by the sites. For the crushing, that's seeds and beans. For refining, that's crude oil. So both figures were there, and we made a calculation ending up in ton CO2 per ton of product. So that's a specific figure that we found, that we and we will show that on one of the next slides. That's our specific energy carbon footprint based on scope 1 and 2. And finally, these are the figures. So we also, as the industry and environmental group, we just recently were informed about the figures. It's always a surprise, of course, what you will end up with, because we do not know from each company. We know companies are paying a lot of attention to that. And you see here in the table, we have the 4 calendar years. These are calendar years, no fiscal years, but calendar years. First row, CR, stands for crush and refining. There you see 41 kilo per ton CO2 emission, specific in almost all the years. There was a small increase in 2021. But what we see here, maybe a bit unfortunately, we see quite a flat line over these 4 years. So not much of a decline. It's obviously not possible for me to explain why and why not. We don't have that insight in the figures, obviously. But anyhow, it should not always be a surprise too that at the beginning, so sites and companies have been starting with decarbonization programs. We heard from Thomas also that we need a lot of innovation techniques, so they're still looking for technologies. I'm sure a lot of companies have, in the meantime, have been looking what they can do, but between knowing what you can do and really performing, a project needs to be approved. Then you need to have permits. We had quite some discussions in the last calendar year on biomass. Will that account for zero, yes or not? So that was an important topic. And also, Jan, you have to execute projects. We speak about a lot of capex. We speak about a lot of investments. So I'm confident we did the start already. Next year and the next years, we will see some decrease. We have to see it because the projects are in the pipeline, so that's what we can expect. For standalone refineries and further processing, we see there a very good decline between 2020 and 2021. Again, not exactly known why that is, and I invite all the members to reflect on the figures they submitted and compare it with these benchmark figures, because as a sector we have now, I think, a good benchmark figure. And that's almost a reduction of 10%. So over 4 years, I think that's then, on the other hand, is a great evolution. So that's a nice figure to show. If we would mix them up, then we would have a good trend, in fact. So, but these are the first figures. Again, we will continue to work with the industry and environmental group. We maybe have to reflect on, did we use the right emission factors? How to continue that? Maybe we have to look back a bit before 2019. Was there already, did we see there any improvement before that period? And for sure we have now a method as a trade association to have the figures and to use these figures in any possible discussions we have with authorities, because that's really, these are the brutal facts. Hopefully we can show progress and our commitment for decarbonization as a sector. So thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. Stefan, please stay here. And can I ask Thomas to join us? We still have 10 minutes, and I would suggest that we take them to raise a couple of questions. And while you may think about your questions, maybe we have a bit of a go. I think, thanks, Stefan. So you mentioned it. This is a basis. We will start. So what could be the possibility from starting from here in going forward? Would that mean setting a target? Would that mean not only continuing with the data collection, but what could be the options?
I think the option is now for sure. The first thing I would invite all members is to reflect their own data, because these are known and you can compare that with these benchmark figures. That's already, I think, good for every company to know, and maybe we can filter out some generic trends or reasons why the trends are this or that. We should definitely continue also to monitor that. As I said, I'm sure there are good projects in the pipeline, and we should see progress. We have now the tools. It can still be refined. That's what I would propose also. We have to be critical on the method we used. It was not a simple, the ETS figures that we used. We had to use some calculation, some assumptions were done. Were they correct, yes or not? We have to be critical on that, but definitely we can continue the way we did. And it's a very helpful tool, I think, for a sector to look and to be challenged also. If the curve goes down, then it will be a challenge for all the members, I guess, to follow.
I have a question for you. Do you have an idea of what the number outside of Europe is?
I think this figure is in the ball game, but usually, and that's already from the past, energy is more expensive here in Europe than in other regions. We are doing well on energy efficiency, and so that's clear. But other regions are following fast, so don't think that it's only Europe. You have China, you have US now doing great things. So we should. They will follow, but we are good.
Thank you. Thomas, your presentation covered a lot of aspects, and it would probably be useful to dig into some individually some of the points you mentioned. I noted one thing. I think rather at the beginning you mentioned, of course, this is a whole economy approach, so everyone will have to decarbonize. And you made also reference to the fact that it would be useful to have a value chain approach. I know you have experience in other sectors, but can you give an example of those value chain approaches that eventually already exist in other sectors?
Yeah, definitely in other sectors things are happening, but it's also dangerous to compare industries. Yeah, we see, for instance, in the automotive industry, certain brands wanting to green the steel, so and go into bilateral business-to-business agreement with green steel producers, and that's something we didn't really expect to happen. That the industry themselves take the initiative to develop the standards to go into the contracts. The gross margin of the steel business is different than your business. They have a gross margin of, 15% gross profit margin, but it is cyclical, so it can be -20 and it can be past months +40 or so. Automotive, 15% gross margin. We look at your industry, the margins are much smaller. Also, if we look at the value chain starting from agriculture, from fertilizers, agriculture, seed crusher, to food producer, supermarket, that the margins are very big at the end, but small in the beginning. So if your consumers start pushing you to decarbonize, it can become very, very difficult. We did a calculation of recently of if we would use green fertilizers with green hydrogen, what would be the price increase for a piece of for bread, for instance? And it will be in the range of 1–2%. So for a final consumer, it's not going to be that much. The energy cost for a baker is much more important, the variation there. But if we then look through the value chain and we start pushing through that cost to the farmer and the food processors that have very small margin, it becomes very important. And I think that is an issue that should be acknowledged more. And it is fine for your customers to want net zero oils, but then it should also be fine to give an appropriate price for it and make that reflect in a bigger margin. And that's where the issue plays off.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still taking questions if you want, but yes, please, Anton.
Coincidentally there. Ant van den Brink, Animal Feed Manufacturers Europe, that's FEFAC. I had a question about biomass use, so this is for Thomas specifically then. As the promise of biomass is there, but I was wondering, is there a kind of biomass? Because biomass, it's a very broad terminology. If we look at our feed industry, we look at the decarbonization of, or lowering of the footprint of livestock production, then feed mitigation is also in that biomass corner, let's say. So maybe a follow-up, the extra question is like, maybe we would be concerned that the green transitioning of one sector goes over the back of the other one, you know. So, which biomass?
Yeah, indeed, we see no clear indications yet of that, but major, let's say, diet change away from meat or a high regulatory push into intensive farming can have major downstream impacts for feed producers. And this is an element where diversification would come in. Such a recent innovation I heard of is a rapeseed meal goes to feed. It is not really suited for human consumption due to the taste, but there might be innovation that might remove some of the chemicals that make that again a suitable protein for humans. So you will have to respond to what is happening down the value stream. With biomass, of course, you're using it energetically. Gasification is an interesting option, and then, interestingly, in the future, your biofuels is something that has been produced in relation to your industry, is high-value chemicals. And there is still R&D needed, but look at cellulose, let's say materials you need to get rid of, like cellulosic fibers, could be interesting to produce lignin-based chemicals, but also high-value chemicals that can be used elsewhere. But again, this is still something that is not there yet, and definitely not at a large scale.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please, Christophe.
Thank you, Christophe from Avril. Always a question about the electricity, because everything, the whole story you're telling is about, in the end, having the available green energy to produce hydrogen, to electrify processes. And I've not seen in your presentation a question of where that electricity comes from. And you were just mentioning fertilizer, just to give you a range of what would be needed for only France to be able to decarbonize the fertilizer sector. You would need probably 5 to 6 nuclear plants to be built just for that. So the challenge is about that production of electricity. How do you see we're going to make it?
It will be a combination of many things. And we also need to look at it from a global perspective. Hydrogen will be produced in regions, green hydrogen, with extremely cheap solar or wind. I think Australia, Chile, parts of southern Africa. But hydrogen is also a molecule that is extremely difficult and also costly to transport. So we'll have to look at what are the carrier molecules that could be important for transporting hydrogen. And ammonia seems to be a front runner there. So if this economy, this cheap hydrogen develops globally, ammonia might be the commodity that is transported everywhere. And then, of course, here its major application will be in fertilizer use. So part of the demand will be coming from, let's say, supply will be coming from outside Europe. On renewable electricity, it will be a combination, or green electricity will be a combination of major investments in wind and then very promising developments in offshore wind, where there is a technical potential of techno-economic potential North Sea and beyond of around 5,000 terawatt hours, which is 2,000 terawatt hours more than the current EU power consumption. That's for major offshore wind alone. Of course, the 3,000 terawatt hours of current consumption will not be the consumption in the future, because we will electrify our buildings, we will electrify transport, we will electrify industry. So you must count that future electricity demand might be 2-3 times higher. And so that's where we will need other renewables. There might be nuclear for the countries that want to invest or keep investing in it. Solar, biomass will need a combination of everything. But most importantly, we need the EU-wide infrastructure so that our power market keeps functioning efficiently. That's my partial answer to your question. There is going to be quite a bit of renewable electricity becoming available, but not everywhere and not all at the same time. So that's where the system challenges will come in.
Thank you. Thomas, I see 2 questions, and I think we have to close because we're eating up into your break. Jordi, and then Emanuele.
Maybe a question on the same line. I mean, price is always the best incentive. I mean, as an industry, when things are economically viable, then the industry moves. And a good example is biomass. I mean, when our biomass is available, I mean, we just make big investments to use, for instance, hulls for boilers or for a cogeneration to produce electricity, and it's very competitive. Then it happens. So in order to really go to electrification, what we need is cheap green electricity. When do you think we're going to have green electricity at par of nat gas price? Then is when we are going to move to full electricity.
That's, I think, never. It depends on the natural gas price and on the evolution of power prices. I can tell you that in certain parts of the world, you will have renewable electricity prices that will be far cheaper than natural gas prices because of the availability of the renewables, but also of the lack of gas infrastructure. So it will depend, it will highly be location dependent. And I think for your sector, the challenge is not only electrification, but to make it compatible with the other things you're doing, such as the use of biomass. And is it then okay for the, let's say, the low temperature heat, we go electrify, but if you need the boost burner, then it's going to be the biogas that comes in. It's these things that you'll need to think about, because if you go for high value, high volume, high temperature, then electricity cost will be. So it's both an economic and a technological issue you will need to face.
Emanuele, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So one question from my side. Emanuele Sicuro from Cargill. What we discuss a lot in the framework also of FEDIOL is how to maintain the competitiveness also of our operations in the region. And in your presentation, Thomas, you were talking about what the US are doing in this space. Now, my question to you would be, do you believe that the measures that the European Commission, that we are currently discussing here in Brussels, that the Commission is putting forward to advance the climate agenda, will also ensure that our operations, so our assets in the region, will stay competitive? And if you have any suggestion around what we can continue to discuss with our stakeholders in Brussels in order to maintain the competitiveness of our operations. Thank you.
Yeah, your sector will be facing certainly the ETS parts, higher carbon, CO2 exposure, come from an environment of high volatility of gas prices, with high gas prices, high electricity prices. So competitiveness at the moment, and as far as I can see in the near future, is a major issue. And so far, I have not seen an adequate policy response, both at the EU but also at the member state level, to address it. And it's an energy cost issue, and it's an investment issue for most, but also for your industry. And I think we will need something that mimics what the US is doing quite a bit, and it doesn't need to have to be infinite, the support. It needs to be a transition support where you can do the green investments, can get to the green electricity, can get to the infrastructure, and stay competitive at the same time. It's both paths that need to be walked. Of course, we see initiatives like CBAM, but they cover only a very small part of sectors and bigger part of emissions. We're not sure that CBAM will actually work. Of course, it was good at sending a political signal to the rest of the world that we are serious in Europe, and if you want to, say, export your steel to here, there will be this benchmark applied. But for majority part of sectors and installations covered by the ETS, CBAM will have no benefit at all.
I think that's quite clear. And on this note and message, I would say thank you very much to both of you for your input. I'm sure that conversation can go on during the coffee break. Please, a round of applause for our speakers. We meet back at 11, please, for the second panel. Thank you. Thanks a lot.